How's it going, everybody? Good? Yeah. I'm experiencing a lot of new things today. I've never been introduced before at an academic symposium, and I've never spoken into a microphone before. And I guess at 23, you should probably have spoken into a microphone before at some point. The full title of my paper is Mormonism and Islam, Nauvoo and Now. And what the point of my paper is to try to figure out the following. When the Mormons were in Nauvoo, comparisons between Joseph Smith and Muhammad, or Islam and Mormonism in general, were left and right. It happened all the time. And what I wanted to look into was where these comparisons came from. What was their source? Why were they made? And furthermore, has those comparisons influenced the contemporary opinion of Mormonism? Have the comparisons between Joseph Smith and Muhammad in Nauvoo, have they influenced the contemporary Mormon perspective on Islam? Okay, that was the question that was driving me. And before I get into those issues, I should clarify a few things. First, I'm not a Mormon. I practice the great apostasy in the Catholic Church. I should also say how I got interested into this subject. It's an obscure subject of study. When I was an undergrad last year, one of my good friends converted to Mormonism, and he hung out a lot with Mormon missionaries, which meant I hung out a lot with Mormon missionaries. So I got to know the faith a little bit through that way. I was also the religious guy on campus, right? So if any religious club or organization needed a vice president or a treasurer or whatever, they called me, right? So I was the vice president of the Muslim Student Association. So eventually, after a couple of years, I put the two together, Mormonism, Islam, and I got interested, and I haven't quit. So there you go. The other thing I want to address is why I'm even crossing these boundaries to begin with in this paper, okay? Why am I taking Mormonism, and why am I dragging it across the religious boundaries and putting it into communication with Islam? I have a short answer, and I have a long answer. I'll give you both. The short answer is because Richard Bushman told me I could, okay? The long answer, I'll explain right now. In 1965, Robert Bruce Flanders published his influential article, Writing on the Mormon Past. In it, Flanders detailed much of the existing scholarship on Mormonism. The author reached the conclusion that most contemporary Mormon scholars would accept that much of Mormon scholarship prior to 1965 was somewhat biased against the Mormons. We don't have to look very far to find this. We can look at Fawn Brody's 1945 publication of No Man Knows My History. Flanders pointed out that times were changing, however. Mormonism, he argued, had successfully become a part of everyday American life, and this new acceptance brought room for an objective study of Mormonism. This is what Flanders called for in his article. Now, the seeds of this new study of Mormonism had already been sown. In 1958, Leonard Arrington published Great Basin Kingdom, an economic history of the Latter-day Saints, a unique study in and of itself. The movement that Flanders, Arrington, and of course many others were calling for would eventually be called by some to be the New Mormon History Movement. And I understand that that's a very controversial term, but roll with me. Roll with it for a second, okay? Within the span of 40 years, groups such as the Mormon Historical Association were founded, books concerning Mormonism were published by the presses of the University of Illinois and also Oxford. Ivy League universities began holding seminars on Mormonism. In short, the outcome of the New Mormon History Movement was stunning. In 2005, the National Endowment for the Humanities sponsored a seminar on Joseph Smith hosted at Brigham Young University. The seminar was to commemorate the bicentennial of the birth of the Mormon prophet. Papers presented at this conference were later published in a book entitled New Perspectives on Mormon History. One article in this book was penned by Richard Bushman, entitled The Commencement of Mormon Studies. Here, Bushman recognizes the obvious. the new Mormon history movement worked, and now it is time for the study of Mormonism to mature even further. Whereas the new Mormon history movement focused its energy on gaining acceptance in the university, the study that Bushman was calling for would cross boundaries of all kinds. Indeed, the book was divided into sections discussing the crossing of boundaries. For example, Part 1 dealt with the crossing of internal boundaries. Part 2 dealt with moving across religious lines, etc. If the matured study of Mormonism implies the crossing of religious boundaries, it should be accepted and welcomed. To take Mormonism across religious lines and compare it with a strikingly similar global faith, Islam. Let me talk about a note on the comparison itself. I am hardly the first person to make such comparisons. Indeed, BYU professor Grant Underwood published an article in New Perspectives concerning comparisons between the role of prophethood in the two faiths. Underwood calls for a further study on the topic of Islam and Mormonism. His call to action seemed to have worked, for in 2008, fellow BYU professor J. Spencer Fluman published an article entitled An American Mohammed, Joseph Smith, Mohammed, and the Problem of Prophets in Antebellum America, which won Best Article of the Year award from the Mormon Historical Association. The comparison itself between Smith and Mohammed, Islam and Mormonism is old hat. Perhaps the most famous book concerning the topic is Bruce Kinney's 1912 publication, Mormonism, the Islam of America. The comparison was not limited to polemics, but also to scholars of Islam. For example, David Samuel Margoglioth, Oxford professor of Arabic from 1889 to 1937, made two comparisons between Mohammed and Smith in two separate books. First, in his landmark 1906 publication, Mohammed and the Rise of Islam, and the second, in his 1911 Introduction to Islam, Mohammedism. Both of these books are still required reading for students of Islam. I had to read both of those books. The history of the comparison goes back even further and comes from within. Indeed, we shall see later, the Mormons in Nauvoo were eager to compare their prophet to Muhammad. So now let's look into the comparisons in Nauvoo. When the Mormons were beginning to settle in Nauvoo in Illinois in 1839, comparisons between Joseph Smith and Muhammad became more and more frequent. These comparisons were made by Mormons and non-Mormons alike. Though there are a plethora of examples of such comparisons, I will only focus on two. First, in Henry Mayhew's 1852 book, The Mormons, and second, in John C. Bennett's 1842 publication, The History of the Saints. Born in 1812, Henry Mayhew is perhaps best known for his journalism in Great Britain. He produced works that are still read today, such as London Labour and London Poor. While researching for London Labour, he encountered a small group of British citizens who called themselves Mormons. Fascinated by this group, he vowed to return to the subject at a later time, and he did just that in 1852 when he published the book with the impressively long title of The Mormons, or Latter-day Saints with Memoirs of the Life and Death of Joseph Smith, the American Mohammed. The comparisons between Smith and Mohammed happened literally before page 1. The author was proud of this book, for he believed it to be, quote, the first history of this new religion. There are 2 points of interest in this book that directly pertain to the topic of this paper. First, Mayhew details 2 comparisons made between Smith and Mohammed while the Mormons were in Nauvoo. The first instance comes in a letter from General John C. Bennett to Joseph Smith. In this letter, Bennett tries to persuade Smith that he needs, quote, a right-hand man. You know, the general writes, that Mohammed has had his right-hand man. And while Bennett doesn't specify, presumably he is referring to either Muhammad's father-in-law, Abu Bakr, or Muhammad's cousin/son-in-law, Ali, both of whom served as a type of right-hand man. Bennett's power of persuasion worked in that for close to a year, John C. Bennett did indeed serve as Joseph Smith's right-hand man. The second instance from Mayhew's book comes in a letter penned by an unknown man, for he signed the letter only as an artillery officer in the United States' artillery. The letter was sent to James G. Bennett, there's lots of Bennetts here, so James G. Bennett, who was the publisher of the New York Herald. For reasons unexplained in either the book or the letter, the officer was traveling west sometime in 1842. On his way, he stopped at Nauvoo to see what the growing gossip was all about. The officer was introduced to Joseph Smith, whom the officer described as, quote, a noble-looking fellow, and Mohammed every inch of him. The officer was then introduced to, quote, an extremely able professor of the name of Pratt. Pratt asked the officer, now, sir, what do you think of Joseph, the modern Mohammed? The officer then related to Pratt how amazed he was at both Smith and the progress made by the Mormons in Nauvoo. The second source of these comparisons between Smith and Mohammed comes from the History of the Saints according to by John C. Bennett. And I understand that John C. Bennett is a very hated figure. I understand that. Bennett is perhaps best known for being the most outspoken, outlandish, and hated apostate in the history of early Mormonism. After honestly and through hard work obtaining his MD, Bennett turned to a life of hustling. He sold diplomas and falsified his credentials, all for selfish interests. He was also a womanizer, which was the reason Joseph Smith excommunicated him from the church. But before he was excommunicated, he played a vital role in Nauvoo. It was through the efforts of Bennett that Nauvoo was officially incorporated into the state of Illinois in 1840. Bennett organized the Nauvoo Legion with impressive results, commanding a group himself called the Invincible Dragoons. In reward for his hard work, he was elected to be the first mayor of Nauvoo in 1841. Bennett quickly fell from grace, however, and was excommunicated in 1842. That same year, Bennett published History of the Saints. Reading the History of the Saints is a lot like reading James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. It's in that you never know really what's going on, you don't know who's talking, and you don't know the point that he's trying to make. The book is a seemingly haphazard collection of newspaper articles, memoir, literature, exaggeration. There are, however, 4 instances that I wish to highlight. Bennett borrows extensively from the New York Herald. Indeed, there are many articles simply reprinted in the book. One such article dated from August 30th, 1842. The article claims to have, quote, a letter from the headquarters of Joe Smith, the prophet, and the second Mohammed himself. In a letter, Bennett writes to the Herald editor, James G. Bennett, General John C. Bennett refers to Smith as the Mormon Mohammed. John C. Bennett reprints another article from the Herald dated June 17, 1842, whose headline reads, quote, highly important from the Mormon Empire, wonderful progress of Joe Smith, the modern Mohammed. Amongst the important news the Herald wished to convey was the fact that Nauvoo recently passed a law, quote, extending toleration towards all religions, even Mohammedan. Bennett also reprinted the article, Bennett also reprinted the letter written by the U.S. artillery officer seen in Mayhew's book. It's important to note that Smith apparently didn't mind the Herald making comparisons between him and Mohammed. In a Nauvoo City Council meeting, Smith encouraged all the inhabitants of Nauvoo to subscribe to the newspaper. Why were these comparisons made? Prior scholarship has pointed out to some obvious reasons, like similarities between the two faiths in terms of revelation, prophethood, scripture, etc. All this made Islam and Mormonism very easy to compare. But one element that has been overlooked in this prior literature is the role of conquest. And I'm kind of nervous right now because my academic advisor who read this said, if you're going to get in any hot water at this conference, it'll be right now. So here we go. Robert Bruce Flanders, in his landmark 1965 study, Nauvoo, points out the imperialistic elements present in Nauvoo. Indeed, throughout the Mormons' times in Nauvoo, there seemed to have been a sense that Mormons weren't quite part of Illinois. A headline from the Herald already mentioned made reference to the Mormon Empire. In reality, no such empire exists, yet as has already been established, not only was there no effort on the Mormons' part to correct this mistake, but Smith actually rewarded such headlining with Nauvoo subscription. In Nauvoo, Smith and like-minded Mormons imagined a Mormon kingdom whose realm extended far beyond a small piece of swampland in Midwestern Illinois. Rather, the flag of Mormondom would be placed in Texas, the nation of Mexico, and even the continent of South America. If the Nauvoo Mormons were intent on hiding this imperialistic imagining, they seem to have done a poor job of it. Non-Mormons recognized that the group that had established itself in Nauvoo were certainly no ordinary group. In a letter written by the artillery officer already mentioned, the officer recounts witnessing a military parade by the Nauvoo Legion, a force roughly 2,000 men strong. As a recognized city in the state of Illinois, Nauvoo was entitled to a militia, but the Nauvoo Legion greatly surpassed any state militia that the artillery officer was familiar with. The officer writes how impressive yet frightening the Legion was. What does all this mean? Did the Mormons intend to conquer Missouri, Illinois, Mexico? Perhaps the subversion of the Constitution of the United States? The officer also notes that there is no militia in the United States that is so religiously charged and motivated. Even if we disagree with the conclusions reached by these individuals, we can at least understand why some people saw Smith as having the potential to be a conqueror. He had gone to Nauvoo and he had conquered it. He had built it from the ground up, made it into an effective instrument of trade and commerce, and he established a militia to protect it. When making comparisons between Smith and Muhammad, those who did so certainly had this issue of conquest in mind, for many at that time saw Muhammad as a religious conqueror. For example, in Sir William Murr's Life of Muhammad from the Original Sources, 1878, an abridged version of his 1861 Life of Muhammad in 4 volumes, Murr frequently refers to Muhammad as a conqueror. In one particular passage, Murr describes Muhammad as, quote, the heartless conqueror. A contemporary of Murr's, Sigmund Wilhelm Coley, perhaps remembered best as a pioneer of African languages, in 1889 wrote a lengthy biography of Muhammad entitled Muhammad and Mohammedism. He too refers to Muhammad frequently as a conqueror, and in one instance refers to him as, quote, the unscrupulous conqueror. These comparisons between Smith and Muhammad therefore make sense. It is easy to assume that they were made because of obvious similarities that rest on the surface, but underneath these parallels lies a fear that Smith, like Muhammad, would in some way conquer something. It is clear that non-Mormons intended this comparison to be an insult, as a means of discrediting Mormonism. Henry Mayhew, for example, did not intend to praise Smith when he entitled his book Joseph Smith, the American Mohammed. Ironically, though, the Mormons took this comparison as a compliment. Orson Pratt, for example, did not mean to insult his prophet when comparing him to Muhammad. He used the comparisons as a means to impress the artillery officer. What the Mormons valued in Muhammad and his legacy was his ability to quickly gain land. And as we have seen, the Mormons imagined doing just that. This attitude speaks volumes about how the early Mormon community viewed Islam. They saw Islam as a conquering faith. Indeed, Smith reveals as much in a letter dated November 13, 1843, addressed to James A. Bennett, Inspector General of the Nauvoo Legion. Smith speaks of the ambitions and aspirations of Nimrod, Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander, Muhammad, and Bonaparte. Here, Smith lumps Muhammad in with other great conquerors in world history. As has already been established, Smith and the Mormons' impression that Islam was a conquering religion was nothing outside of the ordinary. It was a belief held even by those who studied the religion. This also tells us much about how Mormonism had been an international church from very early on. By making comparisons between Smith and Muhammad, Mormonism and Islam, the Mormons are thrusting themselves onto an international stage. These comparisons cross boundaries, both cultural and religious. The Mormons are forcing their way into the pantheon of global religions. If Islam is a major world player, why not, too, a faith that strongly resembles it? By crossing these religious boundaries, Mormonism has, however slightly, made itself into an international church. In closing, I'd like to compare these original ideas of Mormonism, of Islam, to the contemporary ideas of Islam by the Mormon Church. And when I was doing my research, I really, really wanted to see the early comparisons have an impact on how the Mormons view Islam now. Unfortunately, I couldn't make that connection. And I worked really hard to try to find those, but I couldn't find them. Instead, what I found were 3 very dominant ideas about how the Mormons approach Islam. The first of these is a very egalitarian principle. It is very hard to find overly critical critical statements about Islam in official LDS publications. Indeed, this egalitarian principle is found in Mormon sacred scripture. In an oft-quoted passage from 2 Nephi 26:33, the text reads, quote, "All are alike unto God." On February 4th, 1979, Quorum of 12 Apostle Howard Hunter bolstered this belief by delivering a speech entitled, quote, "All are alike unto God," an obvious reference to the passage just quoted. Throughout the Mormon's publication, recent publication from 1979 onward, one sees a very dominant trend of accepting Muslims as brethren in the faith. I found a particularly interesting article entitled "Ishmael, Our Brother," published in a 1979 issue of Ensign magazine by James Mayfield. And the idea of this is that every Abrahamic faith is brethren to the Mormon faith. It's a very noble idea that Muslims, a very different faith from Mormonism, is our brethren in faith nonetheless. Mormons also value the Muslim family structure, very much so. In every article I've read concerning the comparison between the two, inevitably the family structure is brought up. As Mormons have very strong family values, so do Mormons. Mormons are also at least willing to buy into the idea that Muhammad was a divinely inspired individual. The Book of Alma, for example, declares that every nation will receive a prophet that speaks in their tongue that will reveal the will of God to those people. There's also a passage in the Quran that says exactly just that. And the Mormons are at least willing to consider this possibility, that Muhammad was one of the men Alma described in preaching God's commandments to his people. Recognizing Muhammad's divine inspiration is a Mormon idea that goes all the way back to Parley Pratt. In 1855, Parley Pratt and George Smith delivered sermons that spoke very highly of Muhammad and his people. Pratt, for example, said, quote, "Muslims have better morals and better institutions than many Christian nations." George Smith was quoted as saying that Muhammad, quote, "descended from Abraham and was no doubt raised up by God on purpose." This idea is alive and well in 1883 when George, oh, okay. In short, I was very hard pressed to, in fact, I couldn't find any statement in an official Mormon publication that said anything very critical of Muhammad or Islam. So you guys are doing pretty good at that. Thanks a lot for your attention.